It sat at the edge of a quiet cul-de-sac in Perris, California. A modest single-story house, tan stucco walls, a cracked driveway, sun-bleached blinds that never moved. To most, it was unremarkable. A place you pass without thought. A house that doesn't call attention to itself. But something was always off about it. Neighbors couldn't quite explain what. Maybe it was the drawn blinds that never opened. Maybe it was the lack of movement in the yard. Maybe it was the strange silence. It wasn't just quiet. It was hollow. Even in the middle of summer, with kids playing down the street and sprinklers ticking across patchy lawns, the Turpin house stood still. No voices. No music. No lights at night. Just silence. Inside that house, 13 children lived in secret. Not lives of noise or mess or laughter, like most homes filled with kids, but lives of stillness. Each day was the same. Wake up hungry. Stay quiet. Wait for permission to speak, to move, to breathe. They shared mattresses on the floor. Not that they slept much. Some were chained. Some locked in rooms for days. Some didn't even know what a proper day felt like. They were not allowed toys. Not allowed books. Not allowed to go outside. Food came rarely and never enough. And even water had to be earned. The parents, David and Louise Turpin, believed they were in control. They saw themselves as godly, as protectors. To them, the outside world was poison. People couldn't be trusted. Schools were dangerous. Governments were evil. They told their children this over and over. We are your family. We are your world. God chose us to raise you this way. In that house, David was the quiet one, calculating, cold, observing. Louise was louder, erratic, quick to punish, easily angered. They ruled together. They reinforced each other. They planned everything, even how the abuse would be hidden. Online, they posted photos. The children dressed in matching outfits, smiling stiffly, lined up like props. Birthdays were celebrated in bulk, months after the fact, so the photos looked good. Vacations were staged. Social media showed trips to Disneyland, smiling faces, hotel rooms, souvenirs. But they were heavily controlled. The kids didn't eat like other families did at the parks. They didn't laugh like the others did. Sometimes they were brought just for the photo, then loaded back into the van. No one noticed. To the world, they looked odd but harmless. Until they didn't. Inside the house, days blurred together. There were no school bells. No lunches packed. The children were homeschooled, though few could read or write. Their lessons, if any, came from old textbooks, recycled worksheets, disconnected facts. Mostly they sat, waited, listened for footsteps. If one of them disobeyed, asked for food, took an extra piece of bread, spoke out of turn, the punishment was swift. No dinner, a slap, a chain. Sometimes it was worse. They learned to hide, to watch each other, to survive. In the far corner bedroom, the air barely moved. The window was sealed shut, the door locked from the outside. In that room, a girl lay awake most nights, staring at the ceiling. Her name was Jordan. She counted the hours, counted the sounds. She planned. Somewhere inside, past the fear, the hunger, the silence, was a small flame that hadn't gone out. She didn't know what the world outside would do, but she knew it had to be better than this. The house on Muirwoods Road didn't look like a prison, but it was. And soon, the walls would start to crack. Long before the headlines, long before the chains and the rescue and the world's horror, there was just a man and a woman, David Allen Turpin, Louise Anna Turpin. They met as teenagers in Princeton, West Virginia. Small town, quiet, conservative, church-going, the kind of place where nothing much changed and people were expected to stay in line. Louise was the youngest of 6 children. She was pretty, a little wild, and fiercely attached to the idea of control. Her family remembered her as stubborn, sometimes secretive, but smart. She wanted more than Princeton had to offer. More than a job at the local diner, or a life lived inside someone else's idea of normal. David was quieter, awkward, smart but not social. He liked computers, structure, routine. He was the kind of boy who kept to himself and never made waves. They met at church. He was 23. She was 16. They started dating secretly. Her parents objected at first. He was older, strange, distant. But Louise insisted, and she always got what she wanted. By the time Louise turned 18, they were married. David was working for a defense contractor. He made good money. Louise stayed home. They moved from West Virginia to Texas. Bought a house. Started a family. It all looked normal from the outside. But inside their home, the dynamic was already forming, the early roots of something darker. David liked routine. Louise liked power. They both believed they were special. Chosen. By God. By destiny. By something they didn't quite name, but always hinted at. As their children arrived, one, then two, then more, they began to isolate. At first, it was small. No friends over. No babysitters. No visits to family. Then it grew. No outside school. No doctors. No playdates. No voices but theirs. The house changed with each child. What started as clutter became chaos. What began as control turned into something closer to confinement. They moved again, and again. Each move brought more distance from outside eyes. David started changing jobs less frequently. Eventually, he stopped working altogether. He claimed to be retired, but there was no official record of it. Louise took over the home completely. She designed the rules. She delivered the punishments. David enforced it quietly, silently. He became the observer, the gatekeeper. As the family grew, so did the control. Louise began experimenting with extreme discipline. Starvation, isolation, shaming. She saw the children as extensions of herself. Their behavior was a reflection of her success or failure. She blamed them for small things. Spilled water, messy clothes, not speaking in the right tone, and punishment followed. Always. They started filming their vacations, trips to Disneyland, Vegas, theme parks, matching outfits, stiff smiles. To outsiders, it looked strange, but not dangerous. Odd, but harmless. That's how Louise liked it. She curated their image. Online, in family photos, even in conversations with relatives. She spoke of homeschooling, religious values, a private life. She deflected every concern with a smile. Behind that smile, she controlled everything. Meals, toilet schedules, bedtimes. When the children could bathe, she isolated them from the world and convinced herself it was right. David said nothing. By the early 2000s, the family was living in Texas, in a neighborhood called Rio Vista. The house had a chain across the fridge. Neighbors noticed the children were pale, thin. One girl sometimes dug through the trash. The Turpins moved again. California this time. Perris, near Woods Road. A place to start over. A place where no one knew them. A place where the walls could grow thicker and the silence deeper. David and Louise didn't just want privacy. They wanted complete control. And in Perris, they had it. The Turpin family kept growing. One child, then two, then three, and more after that. By the time they reached 7 children, Louise told people she wanted a big family, wanted to raise good kids in a godly home. She said it with pride, with confidence, with that polished tone she had practiced so well. But behind the walls of their homes, it wasn't godliness. It wasn't nurturing. It was silence and fear. There was no rhythm to the house like in normal homes. No weekday routine. No school drop-offs. No birthday excitement. The children didn't learn to read bedtime stories. They didn't pass notes in class. They didn't whisper under covers about crushes or daydreams. They sat. They waited. They obeyed. Louise managed everything. Every hour of every day. She slept late, sometimes until noon. When she woke, the rules restarted. She decided when the children could eat, when they could speak, when they could leave their rooms. David was quieter, but just as controlling in his own way. He worked less, spoke less, but he was always watching. He held the keys, and he rarely said no to Louise. Whatever she wanted, he let it happen. As the children aged, their lives became stranger. More rigid. Normal milestones were skipped. No training wheels. No birthday candles. No first days of school. They didn't have homework. They didn't have after-school friends. They had each other. And not much else. The house grew crowded. Not with toys or books or posters, but with mattresses, cribs, stacked furniture, dirty laundry. The air was always thick. The curtains always drawn. A television flickered in the background most days, looping cartoons or old shows. But no one really watched. The children sat on the floor, thin, listless. They chewed on their fingernails. They stared at the walls. They rocked back and forth. Sometimes they played quietly, pretend games with imaginary friends. No laughter, just quiet motion. It was all they knew. Louise told people she was homeschooling. She ordered books online, sometimes used them, mostly didn't. The children couldn't spell their names, couldn't do simple math. The older ones forgot what grade they should be in. No one checked. No teachers knocked. The school district mailed letters, but they were ignored. Texas had weak regulations. So did California. And the Turpins knew how to stay under the radar. Meals were inconsistent. Some days frozen food, microwave meals, fast food wrappers from leftovers. Other days, nothing at all. The children snuck food when they could, peanut butter, bologna, chips, anything left unattended. They were punished when caught. No water, locked doors, standing still for hours. Some were tied to beds. David helped. He installed the chains, bought the locks, then left for groceries. Louise stayed home. She played games on her phone. She watched TV. The children stayed where they were. They learned to speak in whispers. They learned to cry without sound. They learned to sleep without blankets, bathe without soap, and dream without hope. And as more children were born, the older ones became caretakers. They helped feed bottles, changed diapers, taught the babies to stay quiet. The babies learned fast. The Turpins lived in suburbs, nice ones. Their homes were never run down enough to raise alarms. They were just quiet neighbors. Private. Religious. When someone asked, Louise said they homeschooled. That the kids were fine. She smiled. No one questioned further. Inside the house, the silence grew deeper. The children rarely saw sunlight. They didn't know what day it was. They didn't know their birthdays. Some didn't know what a police officer was. Some didn't know what medicine was. When one child got sick, Louise prayed over them. Sometimes they recovered. Sometimes they didn't. But they were never taken to a doctor. One girl tried to escape once. She climbed out of her bedroom window in the middle of the night. Barefoot, in pajamas. She got to the edge of the yard. Then she froze. She had no idea where to go. No idea who to trust. And no strength to keep walking. She went back. Inside the house, the punishments got worse. Louise became more erratic. She screamed more often. She stopped caring if the children cried. David said nothing. He kept his distance, fixed things, managed the money, but he never said no. By the time the family had 13 children, the house was full. Not of love, not of laughter, but of fear, of whispered prayers, of secret plans. Because among the silence, one child was listening. Her name was Jordan, and she was starting to realize that this life wasn't normal, that what they lived wasn't safe, that the world outside might be different, and that maybe, just maybe, she could get to it. By the time the Turpins settled in Perris, California, isolation wasn't a phase. It was a lifestyle. Their house, sitting in a new development on Muir Woods Road, blended into the landscape. A beige box like all the others, with identical roof tiles and standard garage doors. A clean street, cookie-cutter suburbia. A place built for anonymity. It was perfect. Louise loved it. David did too. Here they could vanish in plain sight. And so they did. The blinds never opened. The doors rarely did. Visitors were almost non-existent. Mail arrived, but no one ever came to the door. There was no knocking, no deliveries, no playdates. The children didn't ride bikes on the sidewalk, didn't play basketball in the driveway, didn't walk to a neighbor's house to borrow sugar, or knock on a classmate's door for help with homework. They had no classmates. There was no school. Louise registered the family as a private homeschool. She gave it a name, Sandcastle Day School. On paper, she was the principal, the administrator, the teacher. No one ever came to inspect it. No one ever asked to observe a lesson. She filled out the minimum paperwork each year, claimed the children were progressing. She submitted no test scores, no report cards. No one pushed. California, like many states, allowed wide latitude for homeschooling. The loopholes became Louise's fortress. Inside the house, the children's world shrank. They weren't just kept from school. They were kept from everything. Louise cut off family visits. Phone numbers changed. Calls went unanswered. Grandparents wondered why they hadn't seen the kids in years. Louise gave reasons. We're busy. We're traveling. They're sick. She gave just enough to avoid suspicion. David stayed quiet. He always did. He was the engineer, the father, the gatekeeper. But Louise ran the world. The children no longer spoke unless spoken to. They had learned not to ask questions, learned not to expect help. If someone came to the door, rare, but it happened, they were told to stay out of sight. Hide in closets. Stay upstairs. No noise. No movement. No witnesses. Even extended family didn't know where the Turpins lived. Louise changed addresses often and rarely gave full details. David and Louise deleted relatives from Facebook, declined family reunions, ignored birthdays. When someone did manage to get through, they spun stories. We're focusing on family. We've chosen a simpler life. But what they were doing wasn't simple. It was surgical. The children were kept inside for months at a time. Their bodies became pale, underdeveloped. Some lost teeth. Many had muscle atrophy from lack of movement. They didn't get sunlight, didn't run or climb or explore. They watched the sky through gaps in the blinds. They saw neighbors walking dogs, heard lawnmowers on Saturday mornings. It was another world, a world they weren't part of. Louise became more paranoid. She believed people were watching them. She believed the government was out to break families apart. She read blogs, obscure religious texts, online conspiracies. She told the children they were chosen, special, different, that the outside world was sinful, evil, and that they were safest when no one knew them. She said God would protect them if they obeyed. She used religion not to comfort, but to control. David made sure their internet use was limited. The children weren't allowed to use computers freely. No email, no messaging, no social media. Even if they had a device, they didn't know how to use it. Some didn't know what a mouse was for. Some had never clicked a link. They had never typed a full sentence. The digital world had exploded around them, and they missed all of it. Neighbors started to whisper. They noticed odd things. Lights on at 3 a.m. Window shades always closed. Children seen briefly, thin, silent, pale. One neighbor said she saw children marching in circles in a room at night. Another noticed that even when the family traveled, the kids looked underfed. No one called the police. They didn't think it was their place. They didn't want to make trouble. That silence became part of the system. Inside, Louise ruled with increasing anger. She became more erratic. She yelled more. She played loud music for hours and made the children stand still while it blasted. They were forced to memorize scripture for hours. If they failed, they went without food. Sometimes they were slapped. Other times they were chained. One to a bed, one to a railing, sometimes two at once. The chains were hidden if anyone ever visited, which was rare. David helped. Always. At night, the children whispered about escape. They didn't know how, didn't know where they would go, but they dreamed. Jordan dreamed the most. She had found an old phone. It didn't work. Not really, but it let her see what the outside world looked like. She learned how people spoke, how they looked, what they said when they needed help. She practiced quietly, in her head, phrases, sentences. Please help me. I need the police. Over and over. It was a start. The house on Muirwoods Road didn't look like it held prisoners. But it did, and Jordan was starting to feel the edges of something else. Something dangerous. Hope. She didn't know what the outside world would do. She didn't know if it would listen, but she was starting to believe it might, and that belief was the beginning of everything that followed. From the outside, the Turpin house appeared ordinary. Inside, it was a place where time collapsed. Days didn't begin or end. They blended together into an endless loop of silence, fear, and repetition. Morning came late. Louise often stayed in bed for hours after the sun rose. She didn't keep clocks in the children's rooms. They didn't know if it was 7 a.m. or noon. They only knew they were supposed to be quiet. Always quiet. They didn't talk to one another unless they were sure no one was listening. They didn't move unless it was allowed. Even the smallest noise could trigger punishment. The house was dark, the windows sealed. The lights were rarely turned on during the day. The smell inside was overwhelming. Trash, rot body odor, urine. Some of the children hadn't bathed in months. Some never used a proper toilet. There was no rhythm to the household. No breakfast routine. No school schedule. No bedtime stories. Just waiting. When meals came, they were erratic. Sometimes it was a slice of bologna. Sometimes frozen burritos. Sometimes nothing at all. Louise often ordered fast food for herself and David. They ate it in front of the children, laughing, dropping crumbs, leaving wrappers. The children weren't allowed to touch any of it. Once a child reached for a cold fry. Louise saw it and screamed. The child didn't eat again for days. The refrigerator was locked. So was the pantry. Any food had to be earned through silence, stillness, obedience. Some children drank from the toilet when the water was turned off. Punishment wasn't just common. It was constant. Children were chained to their beds for weeks. Sometimes months. The chains were heavy. The locks rusted. The beds were stained. Mattresses were soiled and torn. They were given a bucket to use as a toilet. It was rarely emptied. If they cried, they were beaten. If they begged, they were ignored. Sometimes Louise made them stand facing the wall for hours. No movement. No speaking. David watched. Quiet. Present. Complicit. The children wore the same clothes for days, even weeks. Their skin broke out. Rashes spread. Some lost hair from malnutrition. They weren't allowed to brush their teeth. They weren't allowed to wash their hands. Their fingernails grew long, curled, caked in dirt. Their bodies weakened, legs thinned, arms shook. They didn't know they were sick. They didn't know what health felt like. They only knew hunger, stillness, pain. Inside their rooms, they found ways to pass the time. Some counted the holes in the ceiling tiles. Some whispered stories to themselves, creating imaginary worlds. They practiced smiling, unsure how it was supposed to feel. One child kept a notebook hidden beneath a mattress, writing down dreams, fake conversations, names of places she had read once in a discarded book. They clung to scraps of memory, scraps of hope. The house had no warmth. It was not a place of refuge. It was a machine built to crush spirit. Every inch of it held weight. The stairs creaked with anxiety. The hallways hummed with fear. Even the silence had a sound, heavy, pressing. The walls didn't echo. They absorbed everything. Louise's moods were unpredictable. Some days, she played loud gospel music and danced. She shouted praise, made the children watch. Other days, she screamed at nothing, slapped a child for looking at her wrong. She believed she was special, chosen. She kept journals filled with her beliefs, written revelations, dreams, prophecies. David supported her, enabled her. He handled money. He drove. He bought the locks. He said little, but his silence was loud. In rare moments, Louise gave small gifts. A coloring book, a broken toy. But they came with rules. Don't share it. Don't break it. Don't ask for more. The children learned to be grateful for crumbs, and terrified of asking. They tried to help each other. When one was punished, another would whisper comfort. When someone cried at night, a sibling might hum softly to soothe them. They developed a language of looks, gestures, glances. Words were dangerous, but connection, even silent, was everything. It kept them human. At night, Jordan listened. She stayed awake when others slept. She had found an old cell phone. It didn't have a SIM card. It barely held a charge. But she figured out how to connect to Wi-Fi. Sometimes, when Louise forgot to turn it off, Jordan could get online. She watched music videos, short clips from shows, even pieces of news. It was the only time she saw how people lived outside the walls. She learned phrases, copied words. She started to understand what freedom sounded like. Life inside the house was slow destruction, not with fire or knives or blood, but with silence, with neglect, with the careful, measured removal of humanity. Every day blurred into the next. Every breath was borrowed. And yet, in that dark, something remained. A spark. Not loud, not visible, but real. Hunger lived in the Turpin house like another sibling. It sat beside the children on the floor. It hovered over their shoulders as they slept. It waited patiently, day after day, growing stronger as they grew weaker. At first, hunger was just a feeling, a skipped meal, a rumbling stomach, a glance toward the locked refrigerator. But it didn't go away. The meals came less often. A slice of white bread, a spoonful of peanut butter, a microwave tortilla, cold in the middle. Sometimes nothing at all. Louise would order fast food for herself and David, burgers, tacos, greasy bags dripping with oil. They'd sit on the couch in front of the television, eating while the children watched from the hallway. The smell filled the house. Salty, warm, forbidden. The wrappers stayed out in the open. A reminder. The children weren't allowed to touch the trash. Even that was too much. Some of them tried anyway. When Louise wasn't looking. When David went upstairs. A finger dipped into an empty ketchup packet. A crust of bread found under the table. A half-sipped cup of soda that hadn't been thrown away yet. They got caught, and punishment followed. The rules were clear. Food was earned. Obedience brought a slice of cheese. A full day without talking brought a boiled egg. But rarely more. Water was the same. Sometimes the taps didn't work. Or Louise said they didn't. The children weren't allowed to drink freely. When they were caught sneaking to the bathroom for sips, the handles were removed. The older kids figured out how to unscrew the pipes underneath and drip water into cupped hands. When even that was taken away, some drank from the toilet. They flushed it first. They tried to make it clean. They were desperate. Their bodies changed. Hair thinned. Skin paled. Eyes sunk into hollow sockets. Teeth rotted. Gums bled. Their limbs grew too thin to support them. Their muscles atrophied. Some couldn't stand for long. Some had difficulty walking. Doctors later said their growth was stunted. Their organs had started to slow. Their brains, starved of nutrients, worked differently. Basic reasoning became difficult. Short-term memory was scattered. They forgot how old they were. They forgot what it meant to feel full. But hunger wasn't the only thing that stayed. Chains came next. It started with ropes. When a child misbehaved, Louise tied them to the bed. She said it was to keep them safe, to stop them from harming the others. The knots were tight. The rope cut into their skin. One child cried all night. David replaced the ropes with chains. He measured the beds, bought padlocks. He attached metal loops to the frames and fastened the children's wrists to them. They couldn't roll over. They couldn't sit up. They slept chained down like animals. Sometimes they were left that way for days. They relieved themselves in the bed, in the same clothes, on the same sheets. They weren't unchained for meals. Louise fed them bits of food by hand. Other times they were left to starve. Their skin broke open where the metal rubbed. Their wrists bruised. The sores turned to scabs. When visitors came, rare, distant relatives or inspectors, Louise hid the chains. She unbolted the doors. She threw blankets over beds. She smiled. The children were told not to speak, not to move. They obeyed, because they knew what happened if they didn't. The chains weren't just tools. They were symbols. Symbols of control, of submission, of fear made physical. David installed them. Louise enforced them. The children endured them. And no one outside knew. When one child tried to escape the restraints, they were moved to another room. Alone. Locked in. No light. No food. Sometimes they forgot how long they'd been in there. And yet, even in those rooms, they whispered dreams. Of pizza. Of cold water. Of beds with blankets. They imagined running in the grass, lying under the sun, drinking from a glass. They imagined someone, anyone, knocking on the door, coming in, seeing them, saving them. But the house was quiet, the locks were strong, and hunger stayed. Always. The signs were there. Not loud, not flashing, but they were there. Tiny cracks in the illusion. Faint signals that something was wrong. But no one connected them. No one wanted to believe what they didn't understand. And so the children remained hidden, in plain sight. Relatives remembered the children vaguely. Christmas cards with group photos, same outfits, same poses, same stiff smiles. They looked thin, but Louise said they were just small. She called them her little blessings, said she was proud of raising them with such discipline. When family members asked to visit, she always had a reason to say no. They're sick. They're overwhelmed. We're traveling. The excuses came easily. And over time, people stopped asking. In Texas, years earlier, a neighbor once saw a child peeking through a window. Wide-eyed. Still, the window was dirty. The curtains snapped shut quickly. She thought about knocking. She didn't. Later, she told reporters she couldn't explain why. Something felt off, but not enough. It wasn't her place. In Perris, California, the neighbors were used to quiet. Many of them worked long hours. They came home, shut their own doors, minded their own lives. But some noticed things. A light always on at 2 a.m. Children walking in stiff lines through the upstairs windows. One woman said she saw thin arms reaching through the blinds one night. She told her husband. They said it was strange, but didn't know what to do. Delivery drivers came and went. No one was ever at the door. Packages were picked up late, when the street was empty. The lawn went unmowed. Curtains never opened. But in suburban California, privacy wasn't odd. People stayed in their own lanes. And the Turpins were just another private family. The school district had records of the homeschool. Sandcastle Day School. Louise had filed minimal paperwork. No one inspected it. No one asked to visit. There were no academic records. No test results. But in a system overwhelmed with bigger problems, the Turpin's case slid through the cracks. Doctors never saw the children. Not for checkups. Not for broken bones. Not for vaccinations. They were never on file with pediatricians. No prescriptions. No charts. They existed off the medical grid. Entirely. Churches knew the family only briefly. Louise and David visited now and then, dressed the kids up, sat in the back pew. They didn't mingle, didn't stay long, said they were between churches. They always had the right words. Child Protective Services never knocked. No reports had been filed. No one had seen enough to feel confident saying something. No bruises at school. No doctors to flag malnutrition. No witnesses. Just whispers. The system wasn't broken in one place. It was missing pieces in all of them. And the Turpins lived between those gaps. They made a home in them. They exploited every blind spot. And the children paid the price. Jordan, watching from the inside, didn't understand the world. But she knew something was wrong. She began writing down notes on the old phone she'd found. Notebooks hidden in drawers. Under her mattress. She kept track of her siblings' punishments. Their birthdays. Their height and weight best she could. She was building a case. A file for someone. Anyone. If they ever asked. She told herself they would. That someone somewhere would knock. Would see. Would help. But they didn't. So she decided she would have to do it herself. The pieces weren't missing. They were waiting. To be picked up. By her. It happened just before sunrise. The air outside was still. No birds yet. No movement. Inside the Turpin house, everyone was sleeping, or pretending to. Jordan wasn't. She had stayed awake most of the night, heart pounding, eyes fixed on the ceiling, whispering the words she had memorized. "Help me. My name is Jordan. I need police." Again and again, under her breath, shaping her mouth around the words, preparing to speak them for the first time in her life to a stranger. She held the old phone close, the one she had hidden for months. No SIM card, No data plan, but somehow it still connected to Wi-Fi. She had learned to use it piece by piece. Watched videos, listened to how people talked, figured out how to dial 911. She had practiced it silently for weeks. But tonight she would do it. She waited until Louise went to sleep, then waited longer. She listened for breathing, for silence. When the house was still, she rose slowly from the mattress. She wore shoes, a hoodie, the same jeans she had worn for days. Her hands trembled. She moved through the hallway carefully, not stepping too close to the walls. She passed sleeping siblings. She paused at the door. It was locked, but earlier that week, the lock had jammed. She had noticed. She had waited. Now she tried it. It opened. She stepped outside. The air hit her like a wave. Cool. Damp. Open. She blinked. Her eyes hurt. The light was brighter than she remembered. She stood in the yard for a moment. Just stood. Frozen. Then she ran. It was early Sunday. No cars. No people. She walked quickly down the street. She didn't know where to go. She saw a stop sign. Kept walking. Then she saw a man walking his dog. She ducked behind a bush. Waited. She didn't know what strangers would do. She waited until he passed. Then she pulled out the phone. She opened the dial pad. Her fingers shook. She pressed the numbers. The call connected. 911, what is your emergency? Jordan took a breath. My name is Jordan. I need help. Her voice cracked. She was whispering. The operator asked her to repeat herself. I live with 13 siblings. My parents are hurting us. She had practiced this line, but her voice was too low. The operator asked for her location. She didn't know the street. I think it's Perris, California. She had seen it on a piece of mail once. The dispatcher kept her on the line, kept her talking, asked questions. Are you in danger? Yes. Are your siblings safe? No. Can you stay where you are? Yes. A patrol car was dispatched. Jordan stood at the side of the road. She watched for lights. She held the phone with both hands. When the police arrived, she froze. 2 officers. Male. Uniformed. One stepped out of the car. He asked her name. She gave it. She couldn't stop shaking. He asked if she had ID. She didn't. She had never had any. The officer asked why she had run. She told him. About the hunger. The chains. The darkness. She told him about the others. Still inside, he called for backup. Jordan waited while they confirmed the address. One officer stayed with her. He gave her water. She didn't drink it all at once. She had learned not to. Back at the house, Louise and David were waking up. The door was open. One of the children had vanished. They didn't know yet what was coming, but it was too late. Jordan had spoken. The silence was broken, and for the first time in her life, someone had listened. The call had come in quietly without sirens or screaming, but its weight rippled through the local sheriff's department like a shockwave. A 17-year-old girl, escaped from her home, said she had 13 siblings, said they were being hurt, starved, chained. It sounded unreal, but she had a name, an address, and a voice that trembled with a truth they couldn't ignore. Deputies moved fast. By the time backup reached Muir Woods Road, the sun was starting to rise. The house looked normal. Still, beige, quiet. A standard single-story suburban home with blinds drawn tight. The officers approached cautiously. They knocked. David answered. He was calm, not surprised, not alarmed. His shirt was wrinkled, his hair flat from sleep. He blinked at them, as if unsure what day it was. They told him why they were there, asked to come inside. He hesitated, then stepped aside. The moment they crossed the threshold, the smell hit them. Rot, urine, sweat and mold and something else, something worse. They stepped carefully. Trash lined the floors. Soiled clothes in piles. Empty food wrappers. The carpet was sticky. Walls stained. And the silence, it was too complete. No voices. No music. No signs of children. Until they turned the corner. One child sat on a mattress with no sheets. Another stood frozen at the end of the hallway. A girl peeked from behind a door. They didn't run, didn't cry. They just stared, eyes wide, shoulders tense, like animals that had learned not to expect rescue. The officers called for EMS immediately. They moved through the house room by room, found children in every corner. Some could barely speak. Some whispered their names. Some didn't know their birthdays. 2 were found chained to beds. The chains were thick. The locks rusted. Their wrists were raw. The mattresses beneath them soaked and torn. They had been there for days, maybe longer. Louise was found pacing in the kitchen. She tried to explain, said the kids were fine, said they were homeschooled, said they were being raised in a loving Christian household. But her voice wavered. Her eyes darted. She knew this time was different. The children were removed one by one. Some walked. Some had to be carried. Paramedics brought stretchers, blankets, water. They moved gently, spoke softly. The children flinched at every sound. Outside, neighbors watched from behind curtains. They saw ambulances, police cars, reporters beginning to arrive. Someone asked what had happened. No one had answers, only questions. David and Louise were arrested at the scene, placed in separate cars. Neither resisted, neither asked about the children, neither showed fear. They had lived in control for so long, they hadn't prepared for the moment it would end. At the hospital, doctors worked quickly. The children were examined head to toe. Malnourished, dehydrated. Some were in organ failure. None had ever seen a dentist. Some had arms so thin they couldn't hold utensils. One child asked if the hospital food was poison. Another tried to hide a piece of bread in her pocket. They didn't understand safety. Not yet, but it was coming. And the house that had swallowed their childhood was now empty. Silent, for the first time in a very long time. David and Louise Turpin were placed in separate interview rooms. Small, bright, bare, the kind of space designed to make people talk. But neither of them did. Not at first. David sat still, hands folded, eyes down. He asked if this would take long. When detectives told him the charges, he blinked slowly. Aggravated child abuse, false imprisonment, torture. He said he didn't understand. He said the children were being raised with strict Christian values, that they were homeschooled, that everything had been blown out of proportion. When asked about the chains, he hesitated. They were being punished, he said finally, for stealing food. His tone was flat, not angry, not scared, just tired, as if he were explaining a broken appliance, as if he had stopped feeling things a long time ago. Louise was harder to read. She talked, and talked, about her childhood, about how stressful it was raising 13 kids. She said she was misunderstood. They're just skinny, she insisted. That's how our family is. It runs in our blood. When confronted with photos from the house, she became defensive. They're not chained all the time. She said they were acting out, said they were dangerous, said she had no choice. She cried at times, but the tears stopped when questions turned specific. When asked why the children hadn't seen doctors or gone to school, she paused, then smiled, because God wanted us to keep them safe. Meanwhile, the children were being questioned too, gently, with patience. Interviewers trained in trauma sat with them. They used dolls, drawing, soft voices. The younger ones struggled to speak. Some had never been in a room alone with an adult who wasn't their parent. Some thought the police were there to punish them. They asked if they were in trouble. The older children knew more. They talked about the punishments, the hunger, the chains. One showed the scars on her wrist. Another asked if she could take the hospital food home in case it was taken away. They didn't cry much. They didn't know how. But they answered every question, slowly, carefully, and their stories matched, room by room, lock by lock, a clear, horrifying pattern. Detectives left the interviews shaken. Some said it was the worst thing they had ever heard, not because of the violence, but because of the stillness, the years of control, the silence, the total absence of kindness. By the end of the day, there was no doubt. The Turpins had not been parents. They had been captors, and the house in Perris had not been a home. It had been a prison, And for the first time, someone had put that into words. Out loud. On record. With witnesses. With truth. And no way back. The courthouse in Riverside, California, wasn't built for this kind of attention. By the time the Turpin case reached its pretrial hearings, national media had descended on the steps. Cameras lined the sidewalks. Reporters rehearsed live segments. Protesters stood with signs demanding justice. And behind every headline, every photo, every soundbite, sat 13 children whose stories had finally been heard. David and Louise Turpin appeared separately. They entered court in chains, standard orange jumpsuits, expressionless faces. No hand-holding, no whispering, no trace of the smiling, coordinated couple from family photos. They sat behind glass, flanked by public defenders, eyes fixed forward. Sometimes Louise would cry, soft, almost silent. David barely blinked. The prosecution laid out the charges methodically. 12 counts of torture, 12 counts of false imprisonment, 7 counts of abuse of a dependent adult, 6 counts of child abuse, and more. The judge listened in silence. The courtroom was packed with journalists, law enforcement, trauma specialists, and people who had simply come to witness something historic. The children were not required to testify, but their words were everywhere, documented in interviews, in video evidence, in the stories that matched across age, room, and year. Some of their statements were read aloud, voices trembling, lips pressed tight. He chained me when I took a spoon. I didn't know what a police officer was. I thought pain was part of being alive. There were no gasps in the room, only stillness, only the quiet, crushing awareness that this had gone on for nearly 2 decades. David's attorney tried to argue diminished awareness. He said David was manipulated, passive, submissive to Louise. But the court saw the chains, the purchases, the locks. They saw the fingerprints of complicity. They saw silence as a weapon. Louise's defense leaned on religion, mental instability, isolation from her own abusive upbringing. But the court heard recordings, read journals, watched the home videos. They saw the patterns, the rehearsed smiles, the curated cruelty, and none of it changed what had happened. In a rare moment, one of the older children submitted a recorded statement, played in open court. The voice was calm, clear. I forgive them, but I don't want to see them again. The room didn't move. That sentence hung longer than anything else that day. The plea deal came before trial could begin. Both David and Louise agreed to plead guilty. No jury, no drawn-out testimony, just one hearing. One day, they stood before the court, David emotionless, Louise crying. The judge read the agreement. They admitted guilt to 14 felony counts. They were sentenced to 25 years to life. The judge's words were quiet but firm. What you did was cruel. It was calculated. It was beyond the law's reach until now. He addressed them both. You had every opportunity to ask for help, to stop, to protect your children, and you chose not to. The gavel fell. David and Louise were escorted out. They did not look back. Outside, reporters rushed to break the news. The world read the verdict within minutes. Social media flooded with relief, with outrage, with grief. And far from the courthouse, the Turpin children were watching. In separate foster homes, in silence. Some cried, some didn't. But for the first time in their lives, they weren't afraid. Because justice finally had a name, and it was theirs. Freedom didn't come all at once. For the Turpin children, it arrived in small, unfamiliar moments. A bed with clean sheets, a toothbrush of their own, the sound of laughter in the hallway that didn't signal danger. It was overwhelming at first. In the days after the raid, the siblings were separated into different homes. Not because anyone wanted them apart, but because 13 children, all in crisis, couldn't be placed together. They were paired carefully by age, by trauma level, by the way they responded to touch, to noise, to silence. Some cried when left alone in a room. Others panicked when lights were turned off. Some hid food in their pockets at dinner. They weren't misbehaving. They were surviving. They didn't know any other way. Social workers and trauma specialists began the work slowly. First, they helped the children understand where they were. This is a home. This is your bedroom. This is your foster parent. This is safety. They had to learn trust from the beginning. Some didn't speak for days. Others spoke in bursts, unsure what words were safe. One boy asked if they'd be punished for sitting on the couch. Another asked if he had to ask permission to use the bathroom. Every answer mattered, because every answer rewrote a rule they'd carried their whole lives. Food was the hardest. They didn't know when to stop eating. Didn't believe it would still be there tomorrow. Foster parents reported the same pattern. Plates piled high, bread hidden in pillowcases, water bottles hoarded under beds. It took months to convince them that food didn't disappear, that no one would take it away, that hunger didn't have to be part of love. Some children began school for the first time. They were placed carefully, some in classrooms, some with tutors. They didn't know how to use pencils, didn't know the alphabet, didn't know how to read a clock. But they were eager. They asked questions. They listened. They wanted to know what other children were like, what recess was, what a weekend meant, what it felt like to be seen and not judged. Doctors treated long-neglected injuries. Teeth were pulled, bones mended, scars cleaned. Nutritionists created plans. Therapists built routines. Progress came slowly, but it came. The older siblings faced different challenges. They were adults on paper, but years behind emotionally. Some had never held a driver's license, never had a bank account, never been alone in a room without permission. Job programs were brought in. Community colleges opened their doors. Mentors volunteered. Step by step, they began to enter the world. An actual world, not the one they had been told to fear. Jordan, the one who had escaped, became a symbol for the rest. She moved into her own space, started studying, started speaking publicly, quietly, carefully. She shared what she felt ready to share. Not everything, just enough. She talked about music, about journaling, about what it meant to open a window and feel wind for the first time. She never claimed to be healed. She just claimed to be living, and that was enough. The siblings stayed in contact through visits, through calls, through shared moments. They were still a family, just no longer trapped inside the same walls. Now they could choose who they saw, where they went, what came next. The past was still there. It always would be. But now it wasn't the only thing they had. They had beds, books, laughter. They had time. And time, more than anything, was what they had been denied for so long. Now it was theirs. For a long time, the Turpin children said nothing to the world. They were healing in private, learning what it meant to live without fear. But the questions kept coming, and eventually some of them decided to speak. Not out of obligation, not for attention, but to reclaim the narrative, to own their truth, on their terms. The first time Jordan spoke publicly, the world stopped to listen. It was a televised interview, carefully prepared, soft lighting, a calm, trusted journalist. She sat on a couch, hands folded in her lap, back straight, voice steady, and she told her story. Not all of it, just enough. Enough to make the world understand. I didn't know what help looked like, she said. I just knew I had to try. She spoke of the house, the silence, the hunger, the fear. But she also spoke of music, of how she would close her eyes and imagine another life. One where she had friends, one where she could walk outside, one where she didn't have to ask permission to breathe. Her words were quiet, measured, but they carried weight. More interviews followed, not all from Jordan. Some siblings appeared anonymously. Some gave statements read by others. Some allowed their photos to be shown, older now, changed. They spoke about what it meant to be free, to have a key to your own door, to choose what to wear, to say no. And slowly, the public image of the Turpin children shifted. They were no longer just victims. They were survivors. People. Real, complex, unfinished people. Advocacy groups reached out. Documentaries were filmed. Books proposed. Some declined. Some accepted. They were careful. They had spent their entire childhood being watched. Now they chose what stayed private. The world reacted with awe, and sometimes guilt. How did we miss this? Why didn't anyone see it sooner? Questions echoed through headlines, classrooms, courtrooms. Policy reviews were launched. Laws re-examined. The case became part of training manuals, part of conversations around homeschooling, child welfare, mandated reporting. But the children didn't speak to change laws. They spoke to be heard, to exist beyond the headlines, to remind people that they were still here, and that healing is not linear. Jordan began attending events. Quietly, graciously, she spoke at survivor panels, at schools. She said it still felt strange to be called brave. I was scared the whole time, she said. I just kept going. Sometimes she shared her writing, short poems, reflections. She talked about small joys like her first bicycle, like learning to cook, like seeing snow for the first time without a window between her and the sky. Some siblings chose silence. Their way of healing was not speaking at all, and that was okay. Because not every survivor owes the world a story. Some just want peace. To live. To forget. To wake up without flashbacks. To be unremarkable. Together or apart, speaking or silent, the Turpin siblings moved forward. Not fast. Not without scars. But with purpose. Their voices, once stolen, were now their own. And the world finally listened. The Turpin story didn't end with a rescue, or a trial, or a verdict, or a news special. It ended, if it ever did, with questions. Heavy ones, uncomfortable ones. Questions that didn't just belong to the family. They belonged to all of us. How does a family of 15 vanish in plain sight? How do 13 children live in chains and starvation while neighbors, teachers, doctors, and pastors walk by? How does a system built to protect them fail so quietly? The answers aren't simple. They never were. In the months after the trial, state officials launched investigations into Child Protective Services, into the homeschooling registry, into the county's welfare programs. It turned out that even after the rescue, some of the Turpin children had faced further neglect. Overloaded caseworkers, rotating placements, empty promises. Some children were placed in homes where abuse continued, where food was locked away again, where safety was conditional. The story didn't fit the happy ending we wanted, and that was the point. The public wanted to believe that rescue was enough, that once the door opened, healing would follow. But trauma doesn't follow scripts. It lingers, it mutates, it hides in routine. And the truth is, freedom is just the first step. What follows is harder. The Turpin case forced schools, churches, and local governments to re-examine their blind spots. What does neglect look like without bruises? What does abuse sound like when it's masked by scripture and silence? How do we respond when something feels off, but we're afraid to interfere? The case became required reading in criminal justice programs, in social work seminars, in parenting classes. It was taught not as a tragedy, but as a map of what not to ignore. Some called for stricter homeschooling laws. Others demanded better training for teachers, police, pastors. Some just asked for kindness, for people to look twice, to listen closer, to remember that sometimes the quietest children are the ones we need to hear the most. The Turpin siblings moved forward quietly. Some built new families. Some traveled. Some went back to school. Some just woke up each day and chose to try again. And that, in itself, was a revolution. We missed their pain for years. We missed the signs. But if their story teaches us anything, it's this. Listening is not passive. It's an action, a decision, to believe the child who can barely speak, to ask the question no one wants to answer, to be the one who knocks when the blinds stay closed too long. Because sometimes the difference between a locked door and a second chance is someone willing to look in and not look away. The Turpin story isn't just about what was done to them. It's about what we allowed to happen, and what we have the power to stop if we choose to see.